It was a time of turmoil, a moment poised on the edge of a knife. Italy, bruised and battered in the wake of World War I, teetered between chaos and order, revolution and repression. The streets hummed with a murmur of discontent. The air was thick with the scent of change, and all eyes turned towards a man who promised to silence the unrest. A man named Benito Mussolini. In late October 1922, as the shadows grew long over Rome, a sense of unease gripped the nation. The fabric of Italian society was fraying, stretched taut by economic ruin, social unrest, and the bitter taste of unfulfilled promises. The middle class, once hopeful, now trembled at the specter of socialism looming over them, whispering fears of a revolution that could sweep away all they held dear. In this charged atmosphere, the name Mussolini began to take on a new, almost mythic quality. He was the embodiment of Italy's frustrations, its fervent desire for something different, something strong. The masses found in him a figure who did not speak in the careful tones of the politicians of old, but rather with the fire of a prophet, the confidence of a man who claimed to know the very pulse of the people, and when he spoke, they listened. As October came to a close, a plan was set into motion, a march, not of soldiers, but of black-clad men with iron wills. The March on Rome, they called it, a march that would shatter the old world and usher in a new dawn. But was it a dawn of light or a dusk of darkness? The footsteps grew louder, the tension mounted, and in that fateful march, Italy's future would be decided. This is the story of the forces that led to the moment, a story of fear and ambition, of a nation caught in the throes of uncertainty, and of a man who promised to bring order at any cost. Welcome to the Coup Archives, where I aim to explore the coup d'etats and armed conflicts that have shaped history and influenced our world today. Before we start, please subscribe and smash the like button if you enjoy educational content like this. With that being said, let the video commence. In the aftermath of the First World War, Italy was a nation teetering on the edge of upheaval, its foundation shaken by the tremors of economic despair and social unrest. As with the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Hungarian Revolution of 1919, and the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, Italy too found itself caught in the vortex of post-war turmoil. A once proud nation now fragmented and fraying, where the whisper of revolt danced in the air and the streets thrummed with a palpable tension. This was the beginning of the Red Biennium, also known as the Italian Red 2 Years. It was a time when the very fabric of society seemed to unravel. The government, in its desperate bid to finance the war, had flooded the economy with freshly printed money, and the consequences were brutal. By the end of 1920, the lira was once a symbol of Italian pride, had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, worth only 1/6 of what it had been in 1913. Savings that had taken a lifetime to amass vanished overnight, and the rents that landlords collected shrank to almost nothing. The pillars of industry crumbled, with major arms and shipbuilding firms going bankrupt, leaving unemployment to swell like a dark tide as 2 million Italians searched in vain for work. In the countryside, desperation took on a life of its own. Peasants, driven by hunger and fueled by a newfound sense of solidarity, seized land for themselves, defying the old order. In the South, land occupations became a spontaneous eruption of anger and need, while in the North, the industrial heart of Italy, the city streets echoed with the sound of breaking glass and the cries of shopkeepers as riots and lootings spread like wildfire. Prices were slashed in half by sheer force of the mob, as the economic foundations of daily life cracked and crumbled under the weight of popular fury. Throughout the Biennio Rosso, revolution appeared imminent. The very phrase conjures images of a nation at a boiling point. In December 1919, the socialist deputies stormed out of parliament in protest against the presence of the king, only to be met with violence from nationalists, and the streets erupted in general strikes. The Piedmontese general strike in April 1920 saw work grind to a halt throughout the Piedmont region. The Socialist Party and the trade unions gathered in Milan, debated whether to seize this moment to spark a revolution that might change the course of history. But fear, hesitation intervened. They voted against leaving the Piedmont region isolated, a spark without a flame. In the wake of this indecision, unrest only grew. Mutinies, riots, and strikes flared up like brush fires in the Ancona region in June 1920. Threatening to ignite into a full-blown insurrection, the Po Valley, fertile and wide, became the stage for massive rural worker agitation, a tense theater where the harvest itself seemed at risk of being engulfed by the wave of fury sweeping across the land. The Catholic white unions, though ideologically opposed to the socialist Red, were not immune to the discontent that gripped the nation. The CIL, growing in size and influence, led strikes of their own in Lombardy and Veneto, even as a Catholic left emerged that whispered, too, of revolution. And yet, despite their shared anger, the two movements never found common ground. Their ideological differences formed a chasm too wide to bridge. By the time September 1920 arrived, the red tide seemed to have reached its zenith. Over 500,000 industrial workers seized control of factories across Italy. In Turin and Milan, the heart of Italian industry, the workers, many armed and ready to fight, raised red flags over the factories, formed councils, and even began limited production on their own. They believed they stood on the brink of a workers' revolution, akin to the Russian Bolshevik uprising. But belief, no matter how fervent, was not enough to overcome the lack of coherent strategy. The Socialist Party and trade unions, caught between the pull of revolution and the caution of reform, could not provide the direction that might have turned this moment into a movement. The eternal divisions, maximalists yearning for immediate revolution, minimalists advocating for slow reform, shattered their collective power like a mirror dropped from a great height. And while the revolutionaries wrestled with their own contradictions, the government watched and waited. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, a man of pragmatism and political savvy, did not rush in with bayonets drawn. No, his response was a strategy of measured restraint and cunning political maneuvering. He allowed the workers their moment in the sun, confident that without clear objectives or widespread support, the movement would falter on its own, and falter it did. As the days turned into weeks, the logistical and organizational burdens of running the factories began to weigh heavy. Fatigue set in. The fervor that had once burned so brightly began to dim. Employers and industrialists, sensing an opportunity, offered concessions, wage increases, improved working conditions, small victories that sapped the will for a total revolution. By October, the occupation of the factories began to collapse under its own weight, a great wave receding back into the sea, leaving behind only the wreckage of broken dreams. Workers tired and without direction returned to their jobs. The government, sensing its moment, moved swiftly to reassert control, supported by a middle class that feared the specter of Bolshevism. The Red Biennium came to an end, but its legacy was far from forgotten. It left Italy scarred and divided, a land caught between the yearning for change and the fear of chaos. The failure of the socialist revolution and the subsequent disillusionment among workers and peasants opened the door for the emergence of Benito Mussolini and the fascist movement. Benito Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in Dovia de Predapio, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of Romagna, Italy. It was a humble beginning for a man whose life would come to cast a long and dark shadow over the 20th century. Mussolini's father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith, a rugged craftsman with strong hands and even stronger convictions. A socialist through and through, his mother, Rosa, a devout Catholic schoolteacher, brought her son up in a home that was both a crucible of ideological conflict and a sanctuary of fervent beliefs. It was here, in the heat of his father's smithy, where young Benito first absorbed the radical doctrines that would shape his early years. His father named him after Benito Juarez, a liberal Mexican president, planting the seeds of political fervor from the very start. Mussolini's early political leanings were a mosaic of influences. He drank deeply from his father's admiration for Italian nationalists like Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, men who had fought to unify Italy, to make it whole and sovereign. Yet, his father also harbored a fascination for anarchists like Carlo Cafiero and Mikhail Bakunin, figures who believed in the raw revolutionary potential of the masses. This eclectic blend of anarchism, nationalism, and socialism was the backdrop against which Mussolini's early political identity began to take shape. But the man who would come to redefine Italy was not born in a single moment. He was forged by the fires of World War I. In 1914, the world stood on the brink of cataclysm, and Italy, caught between alliances, chose neutrality. This was a stance that Mussolini, then editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti, initially supported. Yet, as the war unfolded, a transformation began. It was whispered among his critics that it was not conviction, but the shimmer of French gold that led Mussolini to change his position, to advance for Italy's intervention on the side of the Allies. Whatever the cause, Mussolini's support for intervention marked the beginning of a profound ideological shift, one that would ultimately lead him far from his socialist roots. As his support for the war solidified, so too did his conflict with the Italian Socialist Party, which remained staunchly anti-war. Mussolini attacked his former comrades with a fervor that bordered on zealotry, accusing them of failing to grasp the national imperatives that had ignited the conflict. His rhetoric grew sharper, his words more cutting, until finally, the Socialist Party had had enough. They expelled him, casting him out like a heretic for his betrayal of their pacifist ideals. But Mussolini was not a man to be easily deterred. When the war began, he volunteered to fight, only to be initially turned down because of his radical socialist past. By August 1915, however, the call came. Mussolini reported for duty with the Bersagliere and soon found himself on the front lines of the Isonzo in the mud and blood of trench warfare. Over 9 brutal months, he fought in the second and third battles of the Isonzo, enduring the horrors of the battlefield. It was here, amid the deafening roar of artillery and the stench of death, that Mussolini's vision of himself and of Italy began to change. He was wounded in February 1917 when a mortar bomb exploded in his trench, leaving his body riddled with over 40 shards of metal. It was a moment of physical pain, but also of ideological rebirth. As he lay recovering, Mussolini's disillusionment with socialism deepened. He returned to civilian life with a renewed sense of purpose and a new position as the editor-in-chief of Popolo d'Italia, a newspaper that would become his mouthpiece, a tool for shaping a new national consciousness. By 1919, he later reflected, stating, "Socialism as a doctrine was already dead. It continued to exist only as a grudge." The man who had once been a fervent socialist had now come to see the doctrine as hollow, a failed experiment that could not meet the demands of the time. He called for the emergence of a leader, ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep of the old order, to revive the Italian nation and restore its greatness. And so, on March 23, 1919, in a small room in Milan, Mussolini reformed the Milan Fascio into the Fasci Italiani del Combattimento, the Italian Combat Squad, a group of 200 men forged from the fires of war, ready to fight for a new vision of Italy. Here, in the shadows of the past, Mussolini began to construct a new future, one in which he saw himself not as a servant of the people, but as their master. A future where the mistakes of the old order would be swept away, not by the slow grind of reform, but by the swift, ruthless strike of revolution. The young boy who had once helped his father in his smithy had now become a man who sought to reshape an entire nation, and in the crucible of post-war Italy, he found a people wary of conflict, hungry for change, and desperate for a leader who promised to restore their pride. Mussolini had begun his transformation, from socialist to nationalist, from revolutionary to dictator. The stage was set, and the world would soon witness the rise of fascism, a force that would alter the course of history forever. On March 23, 1919, just months after the guns of World War I fell silent, 100 men gathered in a small hall in Milan's Piazza San Sepolcro. They were young, battle-hardened, and brimming with discontent. Ex-soldiers, former socialists, and newspapermen, all united by a sense of betrayal and anger, driven by a common belief that Italy's sacrifices in the Great War had gone unrewarded. They were led by a man whose name would soon be feared across Italy, Benito Mussolini, a 39-year-old firebrand whose charisma and rhetoric had already begun to forge a new political movement. Mussolini himself evoked an ancient symbol, the Roman fasces, an axe surrounded by bound rods, a stark emblem of authority and power. They were ready to make their mark on history. The new movement took shape rapidly, fueled by the embers of a nation still smoldering from war. In November 1921, it crystallized into the National Fascist Party, or Partito Nazionale Fascista, which is abbreviated as PNF, a party defined by its fierce ultranationalism, authoritarianism, populism, and a bitter hatred of communism. Led by Mussolini, a politician as opportunistic and pragmatic as he was unscrupulous, the fascists sought to impose their will on a nation gripped by economic despair and social unrest. Italy in the post-war years was a nation on the brink, its streets choked with the smoke of burned factories and the shouts of angry crowds. Deep economic turmoil gripped the land. War debts, inflation, and unemployment left millions struggling to survive. Food shortages gnawed at the stomachs of the working class, while class tensions boiled over the cities and countrysides alike. The returning soldiers, hardened by battle and haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, found solace in Mussolini's fierce calls for national renewal, his promises to restore Italy's lost honor and strength. Fear of a socialist uprising ran rampant through the ranks of the disillusioned middle class, small business owners, and landowners. In Mussolini, they saw a protector, a bulwark against the creeping red tide and against the spread of Bolshevism. And so the fascists grew. Their squads, known as squadristi, stormed through the countryside, especially in northern and central Italy. Wielding violence like a weapon, they attacked, burned, and looted trade union offices and socialist headquarters, murdering left-wing leaders with impunity. Their methods were brutal, their intent clear: to dismantle the organizational capacity of their political rivals, particularly the socialists and communists. The violence was not random, it was systematic, strategic, and terrifyingly effective. Fascist squads led by local leaders, known as Ras, were often covertly financed by wealthy landowners who saw them as a necessary evil to crush the workers' movements. They wielded castor oil as a tool of humiliation, forcing it down the throats of their enemies, leaving them degraded and broken. Cities that resisted fell, one by one, as municipal councils were dissolved and replaced by those acceptable to the right. The climate grew feverish, the streets ran red, and the nation seemed caught in the grip of a low-level civil war. During the national elections of 1921, fascist violence escalated to new heights. Even the moderate press, wary of the endless strikes and turmoil, began to justify the violence as a reaction to socialist provocation. Fascist squads even beat left-wing parliamentary deputies. As the government, paralyzed and complicit, it looked on. By the summer of 1922, the PNF had swelled to 300,000 members. They now controlled several municipalities in the north and center, and the Ras, emboldened by their success, set their sights on a greater prize: Rome itself. In this maelstrom of fear and fury, Mussolini played his cards with a deft hand. He maneuvered like a master politician, balancing brutality of the street with the decorum of the chamber. He cultivated allies among the industrialists, landowners, and military leaders who saw him as a bulwark against the left. He offered himself as a statesman of order and reason, a moderate alternative in a time of chaos. Even as his squads carried out a campaign of terror against his enemies, his strategy was brilliant in its ambiguity, allowing him to be seen as both a radical leader and a respectable politician. Mussolini skillfully maneuvered within this chaotic environment, leveraging his growing influence, maintaining an ambiguous relationship with the liberal government. By late 1922, Mussolini's moment had arrived. The liberal government, weakened by years of internal division and unable to stem the tide of disorder, was on the verge of collapse. and Mussolini stood ready, the axe in his hand, the rods bound tightly together, waiting to seize power by force or by invitation. The march on Rome was imminent, and Italy stood at the crossroads of its future. The world held its breath, unaware that it was about to witness the birth of a new era. In the early hours of October 24, 1922, the city of Naples was abuzz with a sinister anticipation. Inside a crowded hall, amid the smoke and fervent whispers, the leaders of the Fascist Party convened. Their plan was audacious, perhaps even reckless, an insurrection aimed directly at the heart of Italy. This would be no mere protest. This would be the March on Rome, a coordinated, calculated strike to seize power. Rome or death, they declared, a cry that would soon reverberate across the entire nation. Mussolini, the architect of this movement, remained in Milan, a cautious leader watching from a distance. He was a man with a plan, but also a man prepared for every contingency. While his followers prepared for a bold assault, Mussolini himself stayed out of the fray, closely monitoring events but avoiding direct involvement in organizing the march. He considered escape routes, even a retreat to Switzerland if the insurrection faltered, demonstrating his pragmatic approach, an opportunist ready to claim victory or deny defeat, depending on which way the wind blew. The actual groundwork for the march was left to his trusted lieutenants, the quadriumvirs, Italo Balbo, Michele Bianchi, Cesare Maria de Vecchi, and Emilio de Bono, who led the Blackshirt columns in a coordinated advance toward Rome. By the night of October 27, fascist squads began gathering outside the city at key points: Tivoli to the east, Monterotondo to the north, and Civitavecchia to the west. The force swelled to 30,000 men by dawn, a ragtag army armed with sticks, clubs, and outdated rifles, driven not by military discipline, but by a fervent loyalty to Mussolini's cause. They were ready to show their commitment to the fascist vision of national rebirth. Yet, beneath the bravado, they were far from invincible. Most of these men were poorly equipped and lacked the formal training of a real military force. They relied on local sympathizers for food and shelter, their logistical lines thin and vulnerable. A single decisive move by the Italian army could have shattered their ranks, but as the fascist forces closed in on Rome, the true battle was unfolding elsewhere, not in the streets, but in the halls of power. Prime Minister Luigi Facta, sensing the danger, moved to declare a state of siege, aiming to mobilize the army and defend the capital. Yet, at this critical juncture, King Victor Emmanuel III hesitated. He refused to sign the decree authorizing the state of siege. Why? Was it fear of civil war? A hope that Mussolini could restore order? Or perhaps a deeper anxiety about his own throne? Some speculated that he feared being replaced by his liberal cousin, the Duke of Aosta, who might seize power if he resisted the fascists. Whatever his reasons, his refusal proved to be a decisive moment. With no state of siege, the army remained paralyzed, and the government's monopoly on force slipped through its fingers like sand. The quadriumvirs, emboldened by the king's inaction, pressed their advance. While panic gripped Rome, inside the capital, government officials and citizens braced for the worst. Anticipating a violent fascist takeover, Mussolini, now convinced the government would not act decisively, sent an ultimatum demanding nothing less than the leadership of the government. The Blackshirts, despite their lack of organization and weaponry, had become a political force to be reckoned with, not because of their strength, but because of the king's indecision and the government's paralysis. By the early hours of October 29th, the prime minister had resigned, and the king, desperate to avoid a civil war, and urged on by conservative advisors who saw Mussolini as a savior against socialism, made his fateful choice. He invited Mussolini to Rome to form a new government. Mussolini, ever the strategist, did not rush to accept. He waited for a formal invitation, enhancing his bargaining position and making his rise to power appear as an act of royal necessity, not a coup. At 10 a.m., the king relented and sent the formal summons. Mussolini, now certain of his victory, agreed. On the morning of October 30th, Mussolini traveled from Milan to Rome, not at the head of a victorious army, but on a simple train journey. Far from being a dramatic entry, it was a quiet, almost mundane trip. Yet, beneath his overcoat, he wore the black shirt of the fascists, symbolizing his leadership and signaling to all that he had already won. As he stepped onto Roman soil, he had already secured his power, even before the Blackshirts entered the city. Later that day, the Blackshirts marched into Rome, not in a chaotic rush, but in a carefully orchestrated parade, a show of strength rather than a violent assault. Around 30,000 Blackshirts paraded through the streets, their deceitful appearance and makeshift weapons doing little to distract from the symbolism of the moment. The king's endorsement had lent them an air of legitimacy, creating the illusion of a heroic and unchallenged seizure of power. The world looked on, seeing not a revolution, but a coronation. Not chaos, but the rise of a new order. Thus, Mussolini's march on Rome came to a conclusion, not with the sound of gunfire, but with a quiet rustle of papers in the royal palace. It was not a conquest of arms, but a conquest of will, a demonstration of how power can be seized without a single shot being fired, provided one had the audacity to demand it and the cunning to make others believe it was theirs to give. After the March on Rome, a cloud of uncertainty loomed over Italy. Benito Mussolini, the newly appointed prime minister, seemed poised at a crossroads. For some, there was still a flicker of hope that his regime might chart a liberal course, one that could tolerate dissent and accommodate differing views. But the true shape of his ambition soon emerged from the shadows, and any illusions of moderation were quickly dispelled. The Duce had not come to share power, he had come to monopolize it. On January 14, 1923, Mussolini secured a critical step. King Victor Emmanuel III approved a law converting the fascist squads into a state-backed party army. It was a clear sign that Mussolini was not just taking power, he was institutionalizing it. The reality of his intentions crystallized on June 10, 1924, just 2 months after the fascists' sweeping electoral victory. Mussolini's squadristi kidnapped and murdered Giacomo Matteotti, a wealthy, moderate, and outspoken anti-fascist socialist. The murder sent shockwaves through the nation, a stark warning that dissent would be met with brutality. In protest, 130 non-fascist deputies, led by Giovanni Amendola, withdrew from parliament, marking the beginning of Italy's rapid descent into a one-party state. On October 28, 1925, Mussolini stood before a crowd at La Scala in Milan, his words echoing through the Grand Hall, confirming what many had already feared with the following statement. Our formula is this: all for the state, nothing outside the state, nothing and no one against the state. It was a declaration of totalitarian intent, a proclamation that the state was everything, and everything was the state. It was now clear that Italy had crossed the threshold. It had become a totalitarian dictatorship under Mussolini's iron grip. With his power cemented, Mussolini moved swiftly to implement policies that would consolidate his control over every aspect of Italian life. The press was muzzled, education was bent to serve the fascist narrative, and the economy was subject to strict state control. The machinery of the state was reshaped into a tool of propaganda and repression, where every institution echoed the mantra of the regime. Meanwhile, Mussolini cast his gaze beyond Italy's borders, dreaming of expansion and conquest. He spoke of spazio vitale, which translates in English as living space. It was a policy that sought to expand Italian influence and territory, setting the stage for the nation's fateful involvement in the Second World War. The March on Rome did more than alter the course of Italian history. It sent ripples through the fabric of Europe. It demonstrated to the world that a liberal democracy could be dismantled from within, its foundations eroded not by a full-scale war, but by strategic violence wielded like a scalpel. Mussolini's success revealed a chilling truth, that a movement could use brutality not merely to seize power, but to reshape the very rules of politics. The March on Rome set a dark standard for the interwar right, a blueprint for how to cloak tyranny and the language of renewal, to wield fear as both sword and shield. Violence, whether explicit or merely hinted at, became the lifeblood of Italian fascism. It was a tool not just for conquest, but for creation, forging new political spaces and alliances, binding the most radical elements of the fascist cause in a shared creed of force. As Filippo Toratti observed, the March on Rome marked a new chapter in political history, one where legitimacy was no longer a gift of the people through parliament, but a demand made at the edge of a knife. A regime born not from the consent of the government, but from the shadow of a threat. Italy had shown the world a new path, a darkened avenue where democracy could be subverted by those willing to embrace the rhetoric of the threat of chaos over the promise of peace, revealing how easily the ideals of democracy could be trampled by those unafraid to rule with an iron fist. Mussolini's march became a warning, a sign of the turmoil and shadows that lay ahead.